cross and ratty because every night you're out doing this. And they were never going to see this animal. And then one night, I sort of got out from under the tarpaulin and was just sort of wandering around in the rain, and suddenly, about that high above me, on a branch, this animal came out. And it walked along the branch, big eyes, padding along with its thin, thin fingers. And it looked down at me, obviously didn't at all like the look of what it saw, turned around, went back, and left. It was about 10 seconds. And that was it. That was what I'd come for. That's what we'd come all this way to see. And the weird thing for me, and remember that a month ago I'd never even heard of this animal, was that I was absolutely transfixed by this experience. It had an extraordinary effect on me that I'd seen this animal. I couldn't, for a while, work out what it was. And I eventually thought it through in this way, which was that in making my journey from Europe in a 747 and then this old jalopy of an aeroplane up the coast, and then the decreasingly excellent series of carts and trucks, and then the rotting old hulk, and then walking night after night through the rainforest, it was almost as if we'd sort of taken a time journey back through the history of twig technology to the point that this meeting that had happened in the jungle was a meeting between a monkey and a lemur. I thought there's an awful lot of history in this moment, isn't there? That's, we are actually part of the same family. We are animals together on this planet. And there is a huge, deep history to our relationship to each other that we're not normally aware of. Now, we have been around on the planet for what seems to us to be a very long time, but it's only a sort of blink in terms of the geological time span of the planet. But nevertheless, our idea of history is incredibly limited. My wife, who's a barrister in England, she tells me that under English law, we actually have a date for time immemorial, and it's 1189. And anything that was true on or before 1189 is deemed to have been true since time immemorial. But that is really very, very recent in the scheme of things. So I began to think, well, this is tremendously interesting feeling I've had out of this, a tremendously interesting insight into the history of man on this planet and our relationships with everything else on the planet. So I thought, well, let's go and do some more of this. So I said to Mark Carwardian, the zoologist, how do you fancy going around the world looking for rare and endangered animals and writing a book about it? So he said, well, that's fine. That's what I do all day anyway. So we set out we went around the world looking for various animals. And there's one I particularly want to talk about, which is the kakapo, which is in New Zealand. The kakapo is a flightless parrot. It's forgotten how to fly. Sadly, it has also forgotten that it's forgotten how to fly. And people say that a seriously worried kakapo will occasionally run up a tree and jump out of it. Opinion divides as to what then happens. Some people will tell you that the kakapo has developed some kind of rudimentary parachuting ability. And other people will tell you that the kakapo flies kind of like a brick. But the thing is that you will never really see a seriously worried kakapo, because kakapos have not learnt to worry. Now, this seems a very strange thing to say. I mean, we don't think of worrying as being something you need to learn how to do. I mean, living in the Western world as we do, and worrying is basically what we do all day. It's as natural as breathing. We worry and we worry and we worry about everything that happens. But it is actually an acquired piece of behavior. And it comes out of the fact that we have evolved, human beings have evolved in environments that contain predators. Partly we've been predators ourselves, but other things have predated on us. And that is a very, very good way to learn worrying. You tend to be on the lookout. You tend to be very ready to sort of run away or to fight or whatever it is. And but a number of animals haven't necessarily learned that, because New Zealand, as I said, earlier was not part of Gondwana land, it didn't take with it a representative sample of livestock, because it just came up from under the ocean, and therefore there were no animals on it. Well, maybe some dead fish, I don't know, but I mean, there were no... In the end, it got populated by the only animals which could reach it, which, of course, were birds. Also, I suppose there were a couple of species of bat that were native to New Zealand as well, which are in fact mammals, but you get the point. You basically had to fly to get there. So New Zealand was almost entirely inhabited throughout the major part of its history by birds. Now, one of the things that happens when you have an environment which is kind of not completely full in terms of the niches that are being exploited is that animals gradually adapt to fill those other niches. Now, flying is a very, very specialized thing to do, and it has all sorts of advantages. If you want, it's partially, it is a flight mechanism, flight in the terms of wanting to run away from something, and it's a very expensive activity. You know, because flying takes a lot of energy, and energy you get by eating food, and the more food you eat, of course, the harder it is to fly. So you've got so there are sort of constant sort of problems: eat a bit, fly a bit, eat a bit, fly a bit. If one can, if I can be very naughty and anthropomorphize for a moment, it's almost as if some of the animals on some of the birds on New Zealand kind of said to each other, "Well, why we could, since nothing wants to eat us particularly." We could sort of settle in for a rather larger meal and go for a waddle afterwards. And so gradually over a period of time, a number of the birds on New Zealand lost the ability to fly and flowed into the open niche of ground living. And these included, obviously, the kiwi and the weka and the old night parrot, the kakapo, which is this big, fat, strange parrot. And what happened, of course, with the kakapo, having grown up in an environment with no predators, is that when man arrived on New Zealand with his deadly menagerie of dogs and cats and stoats and rats and so on, is that suddenly these animals were waddling for their lives, except they didn't know to do it. Now, it's very interesting what happens when you grow up in an environment without predators. There's another example of it, actually, in the Galapagos. And there's another bird that behaves in many ways a similar way to the kakapo. And this is a bird called the blue-footed booby. And it's called the blue-footed booby really for two reasons. One has to do with the color of its feet. And the other has to do with a piece of behavior that I'm now going to describe to you, which is if you see, on the beach and somewhere in the Galapagos, if you see a blue-footed booby sitting on the beach or on a branch of a tree, you can walk up to it and you can pick it up. Because what the booby is thinking, and this is probably why we call it a booby, is that once you finish with it, you'll put it back. It doesn't know any different because it has evolved in an environment without predators. So this is exactly the problem that the kakapo has had. It doesn't know to run away. It doesn't know to be nervous. So when it encounters another animal, it just sort of sits there and waits for the other animal to make the next move, which is usually a pretty fast and fatal one.